Hello, everybody. Welcome to the most interactive Sunday I've had for quite some time. I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists for this morning. We have Szabolcs Takács, who is the State Secretary for European Affairs, the Office of the Prime Minister for Hungary. We have Nina Gregory, who is Director General and Senior Secretary for the Ministry of Interior, the Republic of Slovenia. We have Jakub Wisniewski, who's the Vice President of GLOBSEC and the Research Director of GLOBSEC Policy Institute. And we have Stefan Lehner, who is a visiting scholar from Carnegie Europe. And we are here to discuss migration, which I am reliably informed by most of the media was so to 2015 and is no longer the big issue du jour. With the implementation of the EU-Turkey deal, the sense of crisis, however one might define it, seems to have subsided, certainly at the highest political levels. More worrying, there seems to be an emerging sense of complacency that we have fixed the problems. Certainly, the EU has never produced so much paper. It's certainly never produced so much policy, from emergency response such as search and rescue through to yet another reform of the Dublin regulation. But in all this frenzied activity, has it actually addressed the underlying challenges facing the European Union with respect to the effective management of migration flows and the effective protection of those in need? We have proliferating instability in the European neighborhood with no end in sight, many of the conflicts and conflict fatigue that is setting in and precipitating movement across the region. We have incomplete implementation of joint operations, whether it's relocation, hotspots, or the EU-Turkey deal itself. And mutual trust within the European Union on this issue is at an all-time low. And we're seeing the extension of temporary borders within the Schengen area as a part of that lack of trust between countries. So in this context, I want to turn first to the State Secretary and say, in some ways, the EU owes some thanks to Hungary for bringing to the fore some of the more fundamental questions on the table that we all implicitly understood but hadn't explicitly acknowledged, that we weren't necessarily all on the same page with respect to what it meant to build a common European asylum system, what it meant to participate in the Schengen area, and what solidarity could be conceptualized as. You've stripped the emperor of its clothes. The emperor is now naked. And having said that Hungary, for example, does not want to participate in the relocation scheme, but contribute in other ways and introduce the concept of flexible or effective solidarity, we now have a moment in the European Union. So my question to you is really, what next? Where do we go from here? Having a naked emperor in front of us, how do we reclothe him?
Well, good morning to you and to everyone. Too many questions for Sunday morning. And you are before lunch, so I try to say things that are easy to digest. I cannot promise, but I'll try to do my best. And first of all, I'm glad to be in Bratislava again. I think TATRA Summit is another major event, and we can be thankful to the organizers that after Mother GLOBSEC, which is a security policy forum, the daughter GLOBSEC, TATRA Summit, is an EU forum and projecting ideas from Central Europe. I think that's all very nice, and full gratitude to our friends and partners, Slovakia and others, of course. Now, I believe that before we get engaged in any debate on migration, these debates must be preceded by trying to make some clarification on some very basic questions. First of all, what is the challenge that we are facing? Migration, how we perceive it as a challenge. Is it something new, something that we were prepared for, something that is temporary, or something which is long-term? Then we also have to answer questions ourselves whether we would like to control, manage migration, stop migration, or encourage migration. We also have to answer very genuinely the questions to ourselves, whether we want migrants in Europe or not, and if yes, to what extent. And probably most importantly, we have to make a very clear and perceivable for our citizens distinction between refugees and migrants, because we are very clearly talking about two different groups of people. So I believe that, first of all, we have to come to terms with these answers. And then we can talk about how to preserve one of the most precious values of the history of European integration, the free movement inside and Schengen system, because this is, I believe, that one of the most important achievements of the history of EU integration for our citizens. And let me quote the Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Franz Timmermans, who said recently that we can protect Schengen by applying Schengen. So this is a very important element of the Hungarian narrative, is that all the member states and all the member states of Schengen must fully apply the Schengen rules without any compromise. The problem is that the migration challenge has shown us that one element of the smooth operation of Schengen was missing, and that's a complete control over the external borders of the Schengen area. If we are not able to manage that, then we will have internal borders, and that will lead to the end of Schengen, and that will have an overspilling effect on the whole European cooperation as general. And you know, despite all the perceptions, in Hungary we believe that although migration is a big challenge, this is not the biggest challenge that Europe has to face. And when the migration crisis started to strike, it further weakened an already weak European integration. And we believe that the reasons go back to 2008, the start of the financial economic crisis, but maybe that's another question. So in more than a nutshell, this is what I can say as a start.
I want to come back to you. I love the protecting by applying phrase. It's similar to Avramopoulos' solidarity is not a slogan phrase. It's sort of meaningful and meaningless simultaneously. But I heard a very senior official in Brussels about 6 or 8 months ago lament that it was so self-evident to the EU 15 when they were creating Schengen that it was intrinsically linked to the common European asylum system, that those two projects were so linked that they forgot to do so legally because it never occurred to them that anyone would question that. And I think over the last year we've seen that questioning, whereby Schengen is seen as extremely valuable to all EU member states, but asylum and participating in the asylum system is not necessarily something everyone wants to sign up to. And I just wonder if you had any comments on that from a Hungarian perspective. You know, does it form part of an intrinsic part of the Schengen system to be able to participate in asylum responsibilities, and if so, how?
Well, I believe that the most recent proposals on how to apply, exercise solidarity, we must visit the basic legal document, the treaty. You know, these days we are talking too much about whether we need to change the treaties or not. Everybody is concerned about the treaty change. My personal view is that that's not realistic. I think it's not realistic to reach a consensus in the first place on a treaty change. And we believe that in Hungary that at this stage we should not be talking about changing the treaty. In a treaty you can read responsibility and solidarity. And I fully agree with you that we have to define and have to speak about solidarity as well. But have we really tried to make a common understanding of what solidarity means? Is anyone here who can tell me 100% that everybody means the same by solidarity? So what is solidarity? It's also a semantic, a linguistic and a political discussion. Well, we believe in Hungary that from our own budget, from the budget of the Hungarian taxpayers, we have already contributed €500 million. That's 1/6 of the money that the European Union has given to Turkey. And it's only Hungarian national budget. €500 million we spent on protecting the external borders. And by doing that, we are defending many European countries and the citizens of these countries behind us. And we consider their security. This is one thing. The other thing is sometimes it's very painful to apply European law, I understand. But if you have ever thought of the map and where Hungary built the external protection of Schengen, the fence, as a matter of fact, we built it in an area where on both sides of the fence Hungarians are living. We have a Hungarian community, a large one, living in Serbia. We are supporting Serbia's EU integration very much. But at the end of the day, in order to fully comply Schengen rules, we had to build this fence. It was not an easy decision, and we believe that this is also a form of solidarity, yes.
So that's what solidarity means for you. Nina, you are, I think, secretly in charge in Slovenia of a small state along the Western Balkan route, a state that came under intense pressure, and a state that is directly affected by the temporary reimposition of borders that has occurred across the EU. What does solidarity mean for you in the light of the last 12 to 18 months? And has it changed?
Good day to everyone. First, let me just, Elizabeth, take this opportunity and just echo what State Secretary said about the event. I think it's a really big and great one. There are great topics here discussed, and I'm really thankful for the invitation. And your question was quite direct, and yes, it is linked to solidarity. So when we talk about migration in European Union, especially after last summer, I think that a lot has been said, and those points taken by the State Secretary of Hungary, talking about the external border, the protection, the Schengen rules, and of course the question about Schengen versus Dublin or Schengen interlinked with Dublin, these are the crucial questions. This is what we will have to deal with them, and we will have to come to the consensus. Otherwise, I firmly believe that we are talking about the end of European Union. It's not that these questions are easily to answer, of course, but there are major differences now currently between member states and politicians with influence, of course, how to deal with them. So what Slovenia has experienced since last summer was really something that nobody could imagine, and it really happened so fast. So we saw that with 500,000 of people coming through Western Balkan routes to Slovenia, and if I may simplify that, because of I would say, short message of welcoming of an important person, really did cause a lot of, tense, but also it showed solidarity. I will have to point out that when the migration flow started on 17th of September, Slovenia got immediate response from 14 member states and a real tangible help. And in that moment, we felt what solidarity really meant. The first, I'm happy to say that, was first among all of them was Slovakia, Czech, was Hungary. I mean, we 4 states, they sent police guards to help us to protect, not to protect the border, but to facilitate the flow. And we got immediate reaction also from the European Commission, also from other member states, as I said, 14 with tangible support. So in that moment of time, this was solidarity for us. We needed, blankets for people, also food, medical equipment, and we got that from other states of European Union. So that's why we understand the concepts of a flexible solidarity or effective solidarity or burden sharing, whatever you call it, in this way, because it was proven in that hard times of Slovenian migration situation that it can be done. So I think it is a valued, a contribution of a V4 when we talk about the future of a migration system, that we have to talk about, the flexible or effective solidarity, because it can be, proven as a good thing.
Yeah, there may well be 28 versions of flexible solidarity, but we should investigate the concept. I mean, Jakub, if I can turn to you, there are forms of solidarity that everyone can get behind, particularly operational and financial. There are forms of solidarity that some are less comfortable with. I was at a summit. Everything's a summit these days, by the way. I was at a summit about 6 months ago where Radoslav Sikorski said, you have to understand the perspective from Poland. We see the failures of integration in Western Europe. Why do you think we would want to put ourselves in the same position of diversifying our nations when we don't see elements of success? you know, you have to understand that we don't see the positive aspects of this. And I just wanted your reaction. You know, do you think he's right, or do you think there's more to be said on that?
Radosław Sikorski, he's my friend, but I think that he's wrong. I think that he forgets about important element of the development of the post-war Europe and Western world in general. The success, the prosperity would not have been built without all these immigrants that came and integrated so well. Of course there are pathologies, of course there are problems, to mention banlieue around Paris. But I think that this is rather a problem of crisis of welfare state, of social and economic models in Europe. These young people that come from Muslim minorities, and they come from North Africa or the Middle East, they are French, but they don't have jobs. And that's why they are frustrated. So to make a long story short, Turkish miracle after Second World War would not exist without Turks who come to the country and worked patiently. If I just may react to my predecessors. Back in the 80s, I was a really young child, but I remember a lot of people leaving Poland to live in Germany, Western Germany, and other Western European countries. Were these people refugees or economic migrants? I think, to be sincere, that these were both at the same time. And nobody would negotiate with us, the German authorities, the Swedish authorities, what kind of category of people we are. We were simply people in need. And this is important to me. You might say I'm a dreamer. I'm not the only one to quote John Lennon. But I think that we need to live up to the standard of Western civilization. The best way to go to America is by ship. And when you enter the port of New York, you see the Statue of Liberty. You know what is written there. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. And the United States were built on European ideals of freedom, and I think that we have to live up to them. Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, once we've defined our European values and our ideals, we then have to construct the machinery within the EU to manage those. And with that, I want to turn to Stefan. You've written that one of the reasons the EU failed to respond effectively last year was because we have unfinished systems that were constructed for fair weather, that we are not building systems ready for crisis. And this happens time and time again, not just in the area of migration, but I think the financial crisis gave us a nice taste. So how do we move on from here? You know, how do you characterize the problem? Is it just a problem of solidarity, or is it a problem of creating broader systems? and where do we go from here?
Yes, in fact, I think there is a great deal of similarity between the migration issue and the Euro crisis. I think in both cases, what the EU did was quite revolutionary. You know, basically offering the freedom of movement to people from 28 countries, and then even lifting border controls so everybody can come and go as he or she wishes. This is really hitting the very core of traditional sovereignty. And it is a hugely ambitious concept. But the EU sort of walked in this direction, I think, without being fully aware of what it was really doing, because it was part of economic integration. It was part of the freedoms of the internal market. It was the sort of logic of economic integration and not so much political integration. And therefore, we failed to build mechanism of institutionalized solidarity, which would make this whole system more robust and resilient to shocks. And what actually happened once an asymmetric shock hit us, the kind of very feeble structures that we had put in place were sort of falling apart. And what I find very interesting is the differences to the Euro crisis, because in the Euro crisis, you had one very powerful institution, the European Central Bank, which is totally unaccountable to any parliament, which is a huge strength in a situation of crisis. And you had a common enemy, the financial markets. So even though there were huge differences of views between the North and South, the debtors and creditors, for everyone, the falling apart of the Eurozone would have been a massive economic catastrophe. And therefore, in spite of all these divisions, it was possible to come to quite ambitious solutions. Whereas in the migration crisis, it's very different. You don't have a strong institutions. Frontex, EASO are very feeble, sort of supportive structures with very weak non-executive mandates. And you have, each member state has an alternative. It can resort to national measures. So when there are lots of people coming in, I saw that very clearly in Austria. At first, everybody cried for the European solution. We have to have a European solution. And then the moment came when they said, well, there is no European solution, therefore we have to build a fence, we have to introduce border control. I think that is the asymmetry between these two questions. And I think ultimately, if we want to preserve Schengen, and it costs massively not to apply it properly, millions every day for the Austrian transport companies. If we want to go back to that, we have to do what we didn't do at first, build this strong institutional solidarity that is able to cope with these challenges. And we need a lot more solidarity. The terrible thing at the moment is that the European Union in a way is in denial. There was this big spike of refugees last year, and now the tendency is to say, okay, now we've Mr. Tusk has said we've turned the corner in the refugee crisis. I think this reminded me very much of President Bush in 2003 when he was on this aircraft carrier and the big banner says mission accomplished, which was just weeks before Iraq fell down in total terror. I think the risk, the big danger is we say, okay, we've solved this thing now. We don't have to build these structures, which are very inconvenient. Nobody wants to give up more solidarity. We can go back to business as usual, and we focus only on the control of external borders. We believe no more people come, and if no more people come, then we don't have to have any kind of relocation mechanism or anything, because there's nothing to relocate. I think that is the big trap at the moment. We believe we somehow are on top of this issue, and the problem is half solved.
Man after my own heart. We are not done. We've turned a corner, not the corner, perhaps. I would like to encourage the audience to submit questions. You can either do so by the app, or we can use the old school microphones and use tweets with the hashtag GTS16. We will open up to discussion, but I think there's a really important point here, and one of the questions that's come through is, can we have an effective common policy without more Europe? Do we have to move in the direction of more Europe? And do our other panelists here see that as a possibility, given the national context from which they're coming? Who would like to jump in? It's a free-for-all now. Yeah.
Let me say briefly that we should not be scared about intelligent, clever integration in some areas. And the Schengen zone needs more competence, not more competence, but more cooperation in many areas. There are some technical aspects of the cooperation, for example, visa information system, Eurodac. These are all useful things that need to be refurbished, and more money, more resources should be given to the migration policy at European level if we want to have a common external border which is reliable, which brings us trust. At the same time, a lot is to be done at the national level through, say, voluntary mechanisms of helping each other. I think that the Visegrad countries would decide wisely to be involved more in helping out the border guards in, say, Greece or Italy, and it could be voluntary. It could show that solidarity is a meaningful term. I would also say that sometimes we focus too much on people who are about to come to Europe, and we forget about people who are already here. In 2015, it was 1 million people. Where are these people? What's happening to them? Do we have good programs to integrate these people so that they don't create problems for themselves and for us, for our societies? And there are useful things if only politicians would not want to address internal audiences by being a bit populist, because some of them certainly are.
Nina, do you think we need more Europe, and if so, which bits?
Yeah, well, we've built our migration policy, or the rules and regulation have been built in years. But then this huge frustration came out when each and every time when we have a massive influx of migrants coming to, for whatever reason, to Europe, there is this shock in saying, well, we don't have the European solutions, we don't have anything on European level, we like this and that, and then we impose national things, because this is how politicians can react maybe quicker. So partly I can totally agree that, you know, where from this point of view, when we have, again, this kind of situation, and what can we, but my question would be, what can we use that we already have? Or can it be used, you know, properly? Or why, if not used properly? And I will tell you the examples. We all totally agree, I guess, north, east, west, south, the whole Europe, that we need strong protection of external borders. We got now new agency, the border guard. We will show solidarity by, you know, getting the policemen there. And this is okay. It's in a way, it's a green, green check. We did that, and we hope that this will work. So that's one point, and super good. But then, when we talk about European Union as a single space of protection, and this is what we are doing since 1999 Tampere conclusions, that we have common European asylum system, there is a question, do we really have one? And obviously, we see that we have 28 of them, or soon 27, doesn't matter. So that means that this is something what we are lacking. And this question, you know, do we have a common European space of protection, also is leading towards the question of secondary movements. Why? Is it even possible? The question of, can asylum seeker really ask for asylum in the country where in which he wants to? Or there is a general rule that he has to apply in the first country of arrival? And there is also a question, in this common space of international protection in Europe, what does solidarity mean? So does that mean relocation of people? I would say, in Slovenian opinion, yes. I would say that this is a part of the solution that we will have to, you know, work on stronger. Because if there are, geographically speaking, you know, member states in the external borders, and we will not stop the flow, of course, although we invest a lot in external border management, I think that, of course, people will come and they will stop in the first member state. So Dublin, maybe we'll kill it. Okay, that we have Dublin 4 on the table right now discussing it. But still, somebody will have to register those people. Somebody will have to, you know, make the procedures towards the third country. So we already have implemented a lot. But there is a question, you know, the way forward. Do we really go in this direction, or do we really change the whole situation and focus?
Mm-hmm.
And just to stay on relocation for the next minute or two, there's often a almost defeatist attitude from some member states saying, well, no one wants to come to us, we're unattractive, no one wants to stay here, they want to move through, and we just want to facilitate that. From your experience, having participated in relocation in the last 6 months, can you give us a sort of personal experience about how, well, can you encourage people? Can you change their minds? Can you sell Slovenia?
Yes, Slovenia believes that the relocation is a part of European solution. So we've so far, we've received from Italy and Greece 20% of people in our quota, and yeah, we had some issues and struggles. You know, it was not easy because, to tell you the truth, people didn't want to come to Slovenia. Although they were not really, you know, doing well in Greece and Italy, but also to a systematic, you know, takeover of people in relocation scheme, they didn't want to come. And we had, well, I'm a practitioner, so I can only tell you what happened in practice. We had 10 boys coming from Italy through relocation, and they were Eritreans. Slovenia doesn't have big Eritrean, community. We don't even have one. So, in fact, they didn't want to stay in Slovenia. They were, you know, informed that you go to Slovenia as also a European state, but no, they didn't want to. They really resisted very hard. So there was a question what to do. Should we send it back to Italy? Well, difficult. That's our obligation. So how to persuade them? And I said then to my girls at the office, I said, you know what, these are young Eritrean boys. They don't know anything about Slovenia, obviously. it was nice summer day. Why don't we take them to bathe in a lake of Bled or to Ljubljana city? There are beautiful girls in Ljubljana for sure. They will change their mind. No. And you know what? They really did change their mind. So, I mean, they're still in Slovenia. But it might be funny. But, of course, the basis is that people have to know where they're coming. People have to know that also Hungary, Czech, Slovak is also a part of European protection space, that they will also be protected in Slovenia. But, of course, it is very important to say that our situation with the money that it comes with the status will not be the same as Germany. And this is, I think, what countries who are reluctant to relocation want to point out, but I'm sure that the State Secretary will tell more about it.
But I think it's important to point out that every country has a competitive advantage. I can't sell Belgium on the weather, but I can certainly sell it on the chocolate.
Exactly.
State Secretary, we've had a question, and I think it follows on almost directly from this, which is Hungary concerned that your uncompromising stance on relocation is affecting your position within the EU more generally and collaborative efforts? And with specific reference to Renzi's statements earlier this week that he wanted to veto the EU budget over what he perceives to be a lack of solidarity. Do we risk precipitating a domino effect whereby states start punishing each other for what they see as a lack of solidarity? And does that concern you from a political perspective in Hungary?
Well, you see, listening to my colleagues, I learned a lot. And it strengthened my views in many respects. First of all, I believe that we don't need to reinvent hot water. As I told you, all the low legal basis is there, but we simply don't apply them. And there are elements of the refugee crisis that can be and should be tackled at a European level. And let's talk about refugees first of all. We all know that EU member states are signatories to the Geneva Convention, so we can very clearly decide by international law and by international practice who is a refugee and what we need to do with the refugee, what protection we need to give them. There are very strong political, legal, moral, humanitarian principles and commitments, especially from the world where we live in. Modern democracies, the Western world of the European integration. However, there are elements of the migration crisis that cannot be tackled at the European level, not because there is no willingness by the member states, but because simply it does not work in practice. We need to stretch back to models that, on the other hand, have been working quite well. Just think about the situation of Spain. The Spanish had to face a huge flow of irregular and illegal migrants a couple of years ago, and they had to do it alone. Nobody talked about solidarity. Why didn't we have the Spanish at the time? That's another good question, isn't it? What they did is that they built a fence to defend the borders, and they made deals, agreements. These days we call them compacts, with neighboring countries, Morocco, Senegal, the Horn of Africa countries. And what we learned from our Spanish colleagues, and maybe we should all visit them in Madrid one day, preferably in the spring or in the summer, and ask them how they did it. And one thing that I learned from them is that you have to make a lot of incentives for our partners outside Europe so that the compacts should work. And again, we should look at our global partners, like-minded countries. Jakub had some reference on the US. I like your quotation, but you must also know that John Lennon was born in a country which was a realist, and he lived and tragically died in a city which was built by dreamers and realists. And I'm very much welcome so many people in the audience who are dreamers. I believe that dreamers will make our world brighter and better. But apart from dreamers, we also need realists who make it possible for dreamers to dream in peace and security. So the thing is that Of course, this whole debate and this naming and shaming exercise, this bashing each other, it does not help an already weak European integration. And we must also think about who are the players who are interested in to weaken Europe. Because how come that suddenly migration has become such a huge problem? We all know about the history of demography in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And again, let me get back to my basic question. I think it's a problem that we keep avoiding answering these questions for almost 2 years now. That what is the ceiling? How many migrants we want in Europe? Well, make no mistake, Hungary is not against any other member state who say that, yes, they do want a lot of migrants in their country. And we might one day say something different. But at this stage, what our problem is that the whole thing is completely uncontrollable. While both the US and Australia are like-minded partners globally, they managed to create a sustainable, manageable migration asylum policy, which is fully in line with their commitments to democracy, rule of law, and human rights. I mean, maybe it's also worth contacting our partners on the other side of the Atlantic.
They also have the benefit of geography.
Can I just return quickly? Here is something from a realist, not a dreamer. Does Europe need immigrants? Yes, very much, for demographic, economic, and also political reasons. And will the Fortress Europe work as a logic? No, no, it will not work. No matter how many investments we will make, we will still have to be an open society in terms of people moving in and out, because this is what we are all about, as Europe, as the European Union, but also Western civilization. And it's not daydreaming, it's a real fact about who we are. But I don't want to create an atmosphere of confrontation, European Union versus Central Europe. I need to say something in defense of Central European governments, because it's important for Hungary or Poland not to be named and shamed. First of all, let me assure you that there are governments in Europe, in the European Union, who have nasty immigrant policies. There are governments who take away golden rings from refugees on day one, and as a kind of compensation for costs they incur to the budget of a receiving country. And let me also say that the relocation mechanism was invented as a top-down exercise in a very unsound manner, because it was a kind of bureaucratic invention. I think that Central Europe can deliver and should not be forced for relocation. There are other ways to show that these countries care. It's about development projects, it's about contributing more to the budget, it's about cooperation with administrations of the countries that are under strain.
I suspect there are people in the Commission who wish the word mandatory had never been used last year.
Can I briefly?
Yes, very briefly, because I want to let the audience have an opportunity.
On the issue of relocation, I do agree with you. I think the decision by the ministers of the Interior by qualified majority vote last September was a mistake, a bad mistake, a question of overreach, one step too far, produced a backlash, a very negative climate. But at the same time, for me, it's quite inconceivable that we eventually will return to a fully functioning Schengen system, where we're going to continue to have refugees because they will continue to come, as you point out very clearly, that we don't eventually move towards an effective burden-sharing system. And that cannot be purely voluntary, that everybody does what he wants or she wants. But it has to be reliable, it has to be monitored, it has to be effective. And it's quite true that there is a problem with relocations, that some people don't want to go to some place and some to another. Sometimes it's a lack of information. But you have the same phenomenon within Germany. There is a massive relocation system operating in Germany. People want to go to Munich and Berlin, but they have to go to totally different places. And there are mechanisms to make sure that they actually stay there. So I just wonder whether anybody on this panel really believes that in the longer term, a fully effective Schengen system can survive without some kind of systematic burden sharing where everybody does its part.
I think it's a very important point, and I think we should also acknowledge that monitoring, implementation and enforcement have not been the EU's strong points to date, so it might take a sea change in that psychology as well. I'd like to open this up to the audience, as indicated by me putting my glasses on. Have a question here, and a question over there, and a question here. Please keep them brief. I'm a softie, but the producers are not, and they will cut your microphone off.
All right. Martin Michlo, Europom Institute for European Policy in Prague. I had a very quick question. You started talking about integration policy. You mentioned Lake Bled and the women. That's a very good start. But in the long term, I wanted to know whether, in the light of talking about information sharing in the previous session, we could start having conversations at the European level about how integration policies worked or may not have worked in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and use these lessons for states in Central Europe, for states such as Slovenia, to have an integration policy of their own that is respectful of their national identities. Thank you.
We had a question over here, and then a question from Milan as well.
Milan Ježovica, Mesa 10, Slovakia. I was very carefully listening to Wolfgang Schäuble on Friday when he was delivering his speech, and he said on migration that we have to be the ones to decide who can come to the European Union and not the murderous people trafficking gangs. And I think that this is a very well pointed phrase, which witnesses two things. One, EU's vulnerabilities were exploited last year. And secondly, when we take Mr. Renzi's statement, we are still fighting with each other and not concentrating on the main goal that it actually has to be.
Can I push you to a question?
Yes, it actually has to be us who can decide who can come to the European Union. So what's your take on that?
Milan?
I have two questions, but with such a tough moderator, I'll better hurry up. The first one is on Stefan. You wrote in February this year that migration is the question that ultimately could break it's a make or break issue for the EU. And you said that it could end up only in three things: either more Europe, less Europe, or the emergence of a new core of committed member states around Schengen and reform of asylum system. What do you think now? And to the others, you might have looked at the paper that is here distributed on what can Visegrad offer under flexible solidarity. One thing is not there might be in the paper, and that is secondary movement of refugees or asylum seekers from our countries, Slovenia, you hinted it, somewhere else to Germany where they want to be. I believe that nothing will change until our governments will try to genuinely attract some of the asylum seekers and refugees to our countries, like Nina is doing it. So Nina, what did Slovenia do different? I think Slovakia is still not there. What can we learn from Slovenia to actually attract some more refugees through relocation or other systems to integrate them here?
Well, apparently it's all about the ladies. But Stefan, there was a specific question to you, and then maybe we can go across the panel to responses to the other questions.
Sure. About the three options, more Europe, less Europe, or a core Europe. I think we already have less Europe. When I wrote this article, we still had 28 member states. Now I think it's 27, and the outcome would have been different were it not for the migration crisis. I think all the Brits I talked to confirm that. So we are definitely on the way towards less Europe. My feeling is that the importance of a functioning Schengen system to the European economy, to the transnational supply lines, is such that ultimately there will be an attempt to save what can be saved. And if it cannot be saved in the current composition of the Schengen group, then I would assume that probably the initiative will come to do it in a smaller circle. You remember last November, the Dutch talked about a smaller Schengen as a possibility. This was probably a warning shot, and nobody wants it ultimately. But I think if we are not able to return to Schengen, and if we see more borders controls coming up, and if the economic damage is growing and growing, I think ultimately there will be an initiative again to do it in a smaller circle, I'm pretty sure. Can I briefly also answer the question of, Mr. Schäuble's point that we should take the decision who comes and not the people smugglers? That's exactly right. And that's makes me so frustrated about the migration partnership and the concept that we are now promoting now. Because the element that is missing here is resettlement of refugees, that refugees, those who can't stay in the region but have to go there, can go there directly in an orderly, controlled way through deals between Europe and the countries concerned, and temporary work visa, sort of regular ways of access to European territory for people who need to come and want to come and whom we need. But if you look at the migration partnerships at the moment, there is a little bit of lip service towards these things, but little bit. But the main point is people should stay where they are, and we are ready to give you some money to make sure that they stay where they are. But this element of mobility, enhanced mobility, is lacking, and therefore I think the incentive structures for the partner countries is totally insufficient. And people will have to rely on people smugglers also in the future.
But just to stay on that point for 1 second before we move to Nina, I agree, resettlement should be an enormous part of this solution, and it's always the bit that gets forgotten at the end of all these statements. But do we have any evidence that the people you would resettle would be the people who would take these dangerous journeys? We don't have any evidence that necessarily the people who would find themselves into resettlement channels would be the ones who would spontaneously move themselves, so we may not. And I think that's what holds a lot of governments back. Until we know we can manage our flow, we're not going to invest in that.
I think the dilemma is basically that, in theory, most governments accept that resettlement is by far the most humane and effective way to protect vulnerable people who need to go somewhere else. But in reality, governments will only commit to such schemes if the irregular entry into Europe is contained and over. So, but as long as a lot of irregular migration inflows continues, they are not ready to make this commitment.
And that's an argument that's been raging in the United States for several decades with no conclusion, because no one can say at what point do we consider this issue under control. And without that benchmark, we may never get to the resettlement point. Nina, there were several questions I think you can take up.
Yes, the question on integration and how different it is in member states, and I think that already in the question there was a part of the answer, because the gentleman said that we should be respectful of the national situation. This is, I think, what we are trying to do. From my perspective, the Eastern European countries, we are trying to do this for several years. If we take a look at Slovenian situation, in Slovenia, you would not believe it, but in Slovenia we have 16% of foreign-born population. That's a lot. That's comparable to Germany, to Austria, comparable to Denmark. When in Slovak you have 3%. That's according to OECD, not to statistic, not to Nina Gregory. So that means that in Slovenia we already have our integration, programs, mechanisms, which were there many years before we entered the European Union, because 16% of people mostly come from ex-Yugoslavia. But that doesn't mean that we don't have experience. And that doesn't mean that we didn't have to try hard to, in a way, integrate them in our society, because of course they were also willing to do it, but there is a huge diaspora. It was easy, so this took years that we got to a situation where this integration with people from former Yugoslavia who stayed in Slovenia was good and effective. And now we have new diasporas. We have something that we haven't had as a maybe eastern part of Europe. So that's, people coming from Afghanistan, people coming from Pakistan, from Syria. They don't have their people in our countries, so that's difficult for them. And how can we help with other experience of Western European countries? We can surely not be helped with saying, oh, you Eastern European, you don't know what integration is, because that's not true at all. There is a huge diaspora of Afghanistans in Hungary, and they're trying to integrate those people. We have, of course, all of us have projects, but I think that, and this is also connected to secondary movement. The point is that the whole, economical and social situation, unfortunately, I have to say so, it's very difficult to compare my country with Germany. When we talk about social transfers, in Slovenia, a refugee with a status can get a minimal social transfer at around 300 euros per month. The same, Afghan who would get more as a social transfer in Germany, because there's such a big difference in our social system, which is, of course, it's the whole story behind, so I will not bother you with that. So, but still, I think that we can do it. We can also show some of the good practice of Eastern European countries in integration, because they already exist. But we have to, spread this word. We have to communicate. And I think this is one point that we didn't talk about on the panel, communication about, first, rules and regulation, which have to be implemented. Migrants will have to know what does it mean if you come as an asylum seeker and claim asylum. You have to prove that you were prosecuted. They have to know, the people. Or if we are accepting them as legal migrants, as economic force, which we need. These are different rules, and we have to attract them on a different way. Or if we take them as through resettlement schemes and help them in third countries and help them too. So communication, I think that this is what we lack. This is what also migrants need, our people need, and also sometimes politicians need, if I may conclude that way.
You're giving me perfect lead-ins. State Secretary, do you have any thoughts on particularly the integration question? And we have a question here that we might draw in as well. If we don't have a common understanding of solidarity, do we have a common understanding of European values? And then how does that fit into an integration question when we have new arrivals fathoming what Europe really means these days?
Yes, very, very exciting questions. Well, yes, integration is another form of responsibility, I believe. That when we talk about responsibility in solidarity and relocation, we also have to talk about responsibility in connection with integration. Because it's very nice that we are encouraging migrants because we have demographic needs. I must agree. But what's the next step? What is the next day? Do we have viable, efficient integration policies? Can we really make these people being integrated into our societies? Do they have the willingness? Do we offer them incentives that they should be willing to do that? Do they respect our culture, our heritage, our identity? Of course, nobody would like to see any more Marseille or Brussels or Nice. But we must also face reality. It was not migrants, newly arrived migrants. They were European citizens who, for a different set of reasons, could not have been integrated into their own societies. They turned against their own society and innocent people. Of course, we would like to avoid that. We have different experiences of integration for historical reasons, geographical reasons, social, political reasons. And yes, my country has an experience of integration of migrants. And let me just recall, 25 years ago, Hungary was neighboring a region where a very painful and tragic civil war was waged. And when people crossed the border, at the southern border of Hungary, we didn't check if he was a Muslim from Bosnia, a Catholic from Croatia, or an Orthodox Christian from Serbia. They were refugees, and they were given shelter without being even questioned who they are. And even more, before this huge migration crisis stroke, we did help Syrians get out of Syria from 2011, 12, 13, 14. We have quite a number of Syrians living in Hungary. But we chose, and we went there and we saw who they are. I fully agree with our realist colleague from Slovakia with his question and remark on what Schäuble said. I cannot agree more. We ourselves have to decide who come, and not the criminal network of people smugglers and human traffickers. I told previously that I consider the UK a country of realism, the former government of Mr. Cameron, I think they had a very fair and very humanitarian approach when he said last year that the UK is willing to take over 20,000 Syrians from the refugee camps in Turkey in the course of 5 years. That means 4,000 refugees a year, not more. And he's coming from the 5th largest economy of the world. And the UK officials went to the camps in Turkey. They chose the people and they took them by plane from Turkey to the UK. This is what we consider a fair and humanitarian approach. This is what we need to do. And I think I also have to reflect on what Mr. Renzi said. I think he's mixing things big time. And what he said recently, we consider it part of his literary work. You know, cohesion policy, cohesion funds is not charity. This is not a humanitarian help to Central Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans to some extent. It's not a form of philanthropy. It's a European policy. I can maybe compare it to the Marshall Funds after the Second World War. The US gave the Marshall Funds to Europe to stabilize Europe for the benefit of Europe and for the benefit of the US. This is how we should look at cohesion policy, and mixing it up with relocation, you know, we consider it part of politics and nothing more than that.
I want to come back on the resettlement question because I think it's a very important one, and it speaks also to what Stefan was saying. If all countries cherry-picked and resettled, and I won't comment on the UK's government's decision to promise to resettle and not quite follow through at 4,000 a year, if you choose people on the basis of their integration potential, on the basis of the skills they need, you are most likely to leave the most vulnerable people, the ones who UNHCR would say, actually, these are the people who need to be moved first, to the back of the queue. How do you reconcile, then, what you think you need in terms of resettlement in order to create a good integration environment or to meet particular national needs, and the needs of refugees, which can differ very, very broadly? And typically now, most resettlement programs really focus on families, vulnerability, and those who really can't stay in the region for one reason or another. You know, is there a way to reconcile these two approaches?
Yeah, it's a fair question, a very fair question. And I agree with you that we cannot leave the most vulnerable behind. I fully agree with you. And it's not that we are going there cherry picking and using you know, all our expertise knowledge to pick rocket engineers from Eritrea and bring them to Europe. It's not realistic. Again, let's divide. If you're talking about refugees need protection. There is the R2P principle, responsibility to protect. We all know that, and we cannot, you know, distinguish between refugees, if he's well educated or not. He's a refugee, and there are standards, international standards. We're talking about migrants with an economic perspective. And again, I'm not saying that we have a moral responsibility only to refugees, and we don't have a moral responsibility to economic migrants. Yes, we do. We are coming from the modern, developed Western democracies. We do have a global responsibility to everyone in the world. But we in Hungary say that in order not to make our troubles more serious, we have to deliver help where the trouble is and not bring trouble here. You see, development policy.
Or you could do both.
You can even strike a balance, but you cannot tell it from an office in Brussels. You must fully consider national competencies, national interests and wishes.
Speaking from someone who normally sits in an office in Brussels, I'd like to pass that same question. Before we go back to the audience, very quickly, Jakub, if you could incorporate it into your response, and I'd also like to know what the others think about, do you choose resettled refugees, on what criteria, and how do you manage that?
I think it's part of a wider package of what European Union is about, because we do useful things as member states, as regions of Europe, that should be taken part into equation. I know I'm complicating discussion a bit. What Poland does with Ukraine, say giving scholarship to people from Donetsk coming to Poland. It's not asylum policy in proper sense, but it should also be taken on board and considered as something useful. I do not have a ready-made response whether we should have a kind of competition for asylum seekers or refugees. If I may just say one word about integration policies, because I have been ambassador of Poland to the OECD. And the specialists, believe me, they know how to integrate people. They know what works and what doesn't. The problem comes when politics enter into place. And then we have questions that do not have ready-made answers. Should women wear burqas in the public spaces? Some people say yes, some governments say yes, others say no, no way. But the specialists will tell you how to build tram or bus network so that the ghettos will not be created in the cities. They will also tell you that it's foolish to put refugees somewhere in the detention camp in the faraway corner of your country where these people will not have a possibility to get a job or where they will not learn proper language by interacting with people. I think these are very down-to-earth problems, nitty-gritty details that simply need to be taken on board.
We've spent a lot of time talking with governments across the EU over the last year about the trade-off between placing people where there's available housing and placing people where there are economic opportunities, because the two definitely do not overlap in many countries, and that's going to be a problem in the future. I think some of these very practical concerns are worth taking into account. Stefan, Nina, very quickly, thoughts on resettlement and how you structure it to meet your needs from an integration perspective, but the needs of refugees from a vulnerability perspective?
Well, I think obviously this is a very complex issue, and I think we are really very much at the beginning of developing a proper strategy on it. I think there is a lot of need, not just for European cooperation, but also for international cooperation. I think you need to involve the UNHCR in identifying the people who are in the greatest need. You have to take into account also the factor of the potential of integration. There is no, what I'm so frustrated about is that we are not really tackling this issue credibly, because I think the gut default reaction of governments at the moment is that we have finally achieved consensus again. In the year 2015, governments were all over the place. There was a Willkommenskultur, and there was basically keep everyone out. Then the mood changed also in Germany, in Austria dramatically, and people moved towards the consensus, get the numbers down, number one priority. So control over borders became the one thing that everybody could agree on. And I recently had talks in Brussels with quite important people in framing these policies, and they say, that is what we can agree on, basically control over borders, dealings with other countries to keep people from crossing to Europe. And we're not really confronting these issues at all, because
so no
it's inconvenient.
Nina, resettlement, what's the thinking in Slovakia? Very quickly.
In Slovakia, I don't know, in Slovenia, I can tell you.
Sorry, Slovenia.
No, it doesn't matter.
It was going to happen at some point this morning.
No, I'm sorry.
I'm kind of glad it was with you.
No, I like Slovakia, so I can as well be here. So it's a good mistake. No, but I can tell you both. In fact, now we're Stefan talked about the legal basis. We have now, of course, also the question on the table in Brussels: is there really a legal basis to do European resettlement? And when we look at the treaty, no, there's not, and we can agree here. So also with Slovakia, that there's a huge question of whether there is a legal, basis in the treaty, and I would say not. But there is definitely now a proposal from the Commission as a regulation which says that we can, if we will do resettlement, which is an old system of bringing in people in need. There are, of course, Nordic countries who are doing this for 50 years, but we in Eastern Europe have less experience. So there is now a good trial from the Commission to do it in an orderly manner for all the European member states, those with a lot of experience and those with lack of experience, as Slovenia in this respect. So we We'll try to do resettlement now in Slovenia. That is going to be our first as a pilot project. Government decided we will take 60 people, namely from Turkey, and it goes in so-called red line in Slovenian governmental, discussion about EU solutions. So we do believe, although we haven't done it yet, as I said, but we do believe that this is also part of the solution. It has to be, because we are taking into account also the migration compacts and other dimension of external migration policy, which has to be addressed. This also is a part of European migration, solution as it comes. And I think that resettlement is a good thing because it's already, as I said, proven and it's structural. But the question is, and that is primarily political question in the member states, who can we take in via resettlement? Do we take vulnerable, as you said, according to UNHCR, of course, or can we take also doctors and the one to facilitate our labor market? This is the question.
Right, we are now into what I've been told is the quickfire round. I have the lady down here who's been very patient, and then hands up again. I missed that last time. Gentleman here, and over here. Very quick questions, very quick answers.
Bolnikowska, Center for International Relations. Taking into consideration that the migrations have been with us, are with us, and will last, most likely after the Syria war is over, it will last for maybe ever. What would be your lessons learned from this crisis in the longer run, thinking strategically, years to come, taking into consideration also this distinction between dreamers and the realistic approach and the national level and European level?
So what are the lessons learned?
Yes, basic for the European migration policy in the future.
Thank you. Martin Selmayr once called me an idealist. I didn't find it to be a compliment. So dreamers, realists, and idealists.
John Worth, I'm a blogger about European Union issues. Securing the EU's external borders has led to 3,500 migrants dying in the Mediterranean this year. Not one person on the panel has spoken about that, despite the fact that we've been talking about migration for an hour. What are you going to do to make sure that less people die in the Mediterranean? Because they are people above all. And the way that you're behaving towards that also, whether it's Brussels or Budapest that tries to solve that, fewer people have to die at our borders. And what are you going to do about it?
Okay, well, let's get an immediate reaction. State Secretary.
Yeah,
How do we deal with the large number of fatalities?
that's certainly a tragedy that we are talking about, and that's very much related to what our colleague said and what Mr. Schäuble said. We cannot just leave it for the hands of human traffickers and people smugglers. Because who are the people who are helping the migrants to depart from the shores of North Africa? Who are giving them money and who are giving them dinghies and boats and whatever? They are criminals, very dangerous criminal network. In Egypt, which is a very cooperative country with Europe and the rest of the world, there are 3 million people waiting. Last year, a cost of a trip, let's call it a trip, although it's quite cynical, a voyage from Egypt or from North Africa to Europe cost 10,000 euro for a migrant. That's the money that the criminals ask from them. This year, it's much less. It's about 1,000 euro. We have a lot of intelligence report on that. And an Egyptian border officer earns 150 euro per month. I'm quite sure that you see the connection between them. First of all, we have to prevent these people to leave North Africa in the first place.
You've not given the solution.
I mean, is the European Union, with such wealth, experience, knowledge, tools, are we really unable to do that? We should be focusing on how we prevent people living in the first place and decide outside the European Union who are the people we need to help and how we can help them, whether it's a refugee or a migrant. So this is the only way. Otherwise, people will keep dying in the sea. I'm sorry to say.
I think the current situation is indeed totally unacceptable and highly frustrating, because what actually happens is the people smugglers put people into dinghies. It's no longer proper ships. they give one of the migrants a satellite phone. 6 miles out, he dials the number of some kind of emergency center, and then European ships from NGOs, but also from the EU mission Sophia, come and try to pick them up. I think this is an absolutely crazy system. I think that the Operation Sophia is supposed to combat people smuggling, and de facto it is really helping their business model. So definitely this is completely unsustainable, and on top of it, more people are dying this year than ever before. So I think there are only two really possible ways of tackling this issue for the time being. There are some crazy ideas out. One is that the EU should occupy the Libyan shoreline and have sort of camps there. Another crazy idea is we should stop picking people out of the water, and then very much fewer people will come. That, I think, is also totally unacceptable. There are two, I think, more promising ways to make sure that fewer people come to Libya from Africa. There are actually more people dying in the Sahara than in the Mediterranean, because this is, nobody knows this, nobody writes about it, but in terms of the deadliest part of the pathway to Europe is really the desert south of Libya. It's not the Mediterranean. And the other thing is to patiently try to build up stability in Libya and functioning authorities there. Without them, there is just no way
So a quick fix.
control the influence.
You've got a quick fix. I mean, I should say I have to plug my own institute. I co-authored with a colleague a book on maritime migration, and we've described this particular situation as a wicked problem, a problem for which there is no good solution, and a series of bad options. And I think combining that with what some of our other panelists have said, some of the solutions that are viable are long-term solutions, but deaths are immediate and increasing every day. So that we have a problem of timelines, I think, as well. What I'd like to do is ask our other two panelists also some final thoughts and come back to the lessons learned. Have we learned anything from this crisis? Are we prepared for the next one? And what might it look like? If I can ask Jakub and then Nina.
I think it's part of a bigger disease of Europe. I imagine European Union these days as a patient with a chronic depression, almost suicidal, which means that such a person does not go and change their life completely for now. They don't go to gym or to university. They simply need to calm down and maybe go to psychoanalyst and to find out again what they really want and what they want to represent. And I think it's an important lesson for us. That if we go crazy about changing the whole system of migration, I don't know, Schengen out or Dublin regulation, and without thinking what will come next, it's not gonna bring good results. So I would say work patiently on the big questions around European integration, and for now, just quick fixes that are rather technical, maybe not inspiring by their nature.
And regular group therapy for all. Nina.
Yeah, I can totally echo with you. I can totally agree. I can just, maybe point six points in my opinion that this would come as a realization of what you've said in theory. In practice, I would say strong protection of external borders and maintaining Schengen. EU as a single space of protection with all the mechanisms which have to be installed at the EU level, not national level. Then the third thing would be EU return policy together with external dimension of migration. The fourth would be definitely flexible solidarity, burden sharing, also relocation. The fifth, definitely what we haven't talked about today, but I think it's very important, the concept of temporary protection. This is what is, I would say, kind of a lost or forgotten concept in Europe. We already have it, but we haven't used it in practice. And I think it would solve many of the problems or situation in a huge migration situation or flows. And the sixth, I would say, the common communication. Communication towards the migrants and also towards our internal public.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion for me, and I don't often learn things, so I'd like to thank you all for your participation. And this is a problem I think we will, much to the chagrin of most of the people sat on the stage, still be talking about in 2020 and 2025. I don't think these solutions are going to come quickly, and some of the things that Stefan outlined are going to be generational activities. talking about trying to help people in the long term, whether it's integration within the EU or through these migration partnerships. These will be policies that will take a long time to take effect, and only if we can find a modicum of solidarity and a common language to speak about these things within the European Union, which we currently don't seem to have, though I think we've made some progress today. I am being told that refreshments are available just outside in the lobby for a reasonable price. But please let me remind you to be back in your seats. I'm being told 12 o'clock, but given that it's 1 minute to 12, I'm going to say 12:30 for the final session on rebuilding trust in the EU. And we've seen what lack of trust does, so let's find out how to rebuild it in the final session and all go home with a smile on our faces. Thank you very much.
Innovating driving has always been our passion. It keeps us moving forward. It inspires us to create timeless beauty and to challenge the boundaries of physics. We will push your driving pleasure to the next level and even beyond, making sure there will be exciting times ahead.
What happened to hope and change? Today, Europeans live in fear of change, not hope for the future. In many countries, public anger is at boiling point, and far-right politicians are blaming the lack of jobs on immigrants and ethnic minorities. How can we restore hope and optimism for change? Debating Europe, in partnership with the Open Society Foundations, has been asking Europeans to share their thoughts and comments in a series of online debates titled Changing the Politics of Fear. We've been approached